Okay, so our research was designed and the data was collected just after the first lockdown. And as with, I think, any other researcher at that time, it was a very speedy, let's get this while we can and capture some perceptions while we have the chance. So really this research was designed because we felt at the time that there was not very much research that was looking specifically at the impact of the first lockdown on children that were aged 2 at the time. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. We really wanted to explore not only the effect of lockdown more broadly, but also that impact that the pause had for children who were ordinarily attending formal early childcare settings. So really, we were wanting to explore the experiences of families where they had children that were 2 that were going consistently into formal childcare settings. Then lockdown happened and they lost that opportunity and there was the pause. So we weren't looking at families, for example, of key workers where they were continuing to attend early years provision. So just to give a bit more context about why we wanted to look at 2-year-olds specifically, we knew that the benefits for 2-year-olds in formal, particularly group settings, were less certain than for children aged 3 to 4. And a lot of the research at the time, although there was very little when this study was designed, was looking at children in the early years and combining age groups. So, for example, there was research focusing upon the parent perceptions of children aged 2 to 4 and looking at that preschool group as a whole. And then later, there was research published looking at the experiences of families with children aged 24 months and under. So it was really looking at babies and 2-year-olds, or 2-year-olds with also 3 and 4-year-olds. But we felt there was a real gap to look at 2-year-olds specifically, because we knew that, of course, for 2-year-olds, this is a age that warrants exploration, because actually the needs of 2-year-olds are often quite different to those of earlier infants or of 3 and 4-year-olds. The very little research that was emerging at the time of the study design was indicating that the lockdown had an effect on personal, social, emotional development. So when we were designing this study, we were really sure that we wanted to look specifically at PSED to see what parent perceptions were about the impact of lockdown on their 2-year-old children. We did know from previous literature that there were some interesting findings around social emotional development for children aged 2. So, for example, some aspects of it really benefited from time spent in formal group childcare settings, whereas other aspects seemed to benefit from time spent in a stimulating home learning environment. And although those effects were independent of each other, what it seemed like, where there were lots of headlines saying that lockdown has had a negative effect on social emotional development on children in the early years, but it didn't really unpick the nuance that we wondered if was there actually, whether there were some parts of personal, social, emotional development that were more negatively impacted, or some that even maybe benefited from time spent in the home learning environment. So we had a focus on PSED within our study design. And also we felt that it was interesting that the early results around the impact on child development from that lockdown were overwhelmingly negative. And at the time of study design, there wasn't any reporting on the positive effects. So within our research design, we built in some qualitative questions, which we'll speak about later, which simply ask parents, were there any positive effects? Did you feel any positive impact upon your child's development age 2? So that's the context. That's why we wanted to explore it, really. And I should add at this point that I did have a personal professional interest, because in a previous role before I joined the University of Chichester, I supported 2-year-olds in early childcare settings. So I spent quite a bit of time watching the challenges for particularly pack away PVI settings in having to make provisions for 2-year-olds when actually it was really challenging for them. So, for example, finding space for naps for children who normally nap and still napped age 2 in a busy kind of village hall environment was quite tricky. So I should say that I've always been interested in 2-year-olds really because of that. So our two kind of sub-research questions heading into the data collection stage were, what was the impact of the pause on their child's development and well-being? And to what extent were specific aspects of PSED impacted? So as I say, we really wanted to unpick the detail there around social and emotional development. So we wanted to gather the perceptions of parents rather than practitioners. And that was because it was the parents who were witnessing that stage, that time at home during that lockdown. And when we say parents, we're very broad in this definition, although the people responding to the survey were predominantly mothers or define themselves as mothers. So we took a mixed methods approach. We wanted to explore the general impact. So we had qualitative open questions, but we also wanted to explore a hypothesis around PSED. So we also had quantitative Likert scales to explore different aspects of PSED. So we used an online survey, and this survey was then distributed via social media. It was also distributed via local authorities. We pushed it out to their PVI settings, who then sent it on to their parents. So we had a few different channels of distribution, and our responses really picked up when the survey found its way into these kind of parent groups of parents looking for support in supporting their children at home during that lockdown and post-lockdown period. So it's a longitudinal design, and we're just about to enter into our second phase of data collection. So the first phase happened in July after the first lockdown, and we are just about to revisit these same families of the children who were then 2 to ask them the same questions and see what response we get. So in one way, the web survey was fantastic because the reach was really far. We had a really high response rate. In another way, it was a bit of a disadvantage in terms of limitations of the study. We are very conscious that it was those parents looking for support. So potentially you could argue that they were parents who were already more invested or more engaged or interested in their child's development who were responding to this survey. Yes. So we had the 2 open questions, which were simply, were there any negative impacts upon your child during this period of lockdown? If so, what were they? And were there any positive impacts? And if so, what were they? And then we had our closed questions that assessed the PSED statements. So some of you here might have knowledge of the parent support documents that are given to parents of children who attend early year settings to explain the non-statutory curriculum guidance. So it runs aside development matters, and our quantitative questions were taken from that document that was used at the time. Our reasoning being that hopefully those statements around social emotional development would be already considered in a way that parents were able to understand them, make sense of them, and potentially some parents might have seen those statements before and therefore feel familiar with them. As with development matters, there were overlapping age bands, and we went for the age band that included 2-year-olds and just started to push into 3-year-olds as well, rather than the up until 26 months banding, which would have only just caught some of our children. So that's where our statements came from. And we asked, to which extent do you think that lockdown has had an impact on your child's ability to do this thing? Has it made it harder? Has it made it easier? Or has it had no effect at all on your child's ability to do these things relating to personal, social, emotional development? So at this stage, I was really excited. My colleague and I had talked about how we really wanted to get this data, and it was quite a rapid research design because time was obviously running out while it was fresh in the minds of the parents, but also really aware that it was going to be and was a huge data set. As always, when you've got quantitative and qualitative, had the potential to be really quite overwhelming, at which point we recruited our lovely colleague Lorna, who had just completed further postgraduate studies in data analysis, and said, please come and help us to analyse this data. So I will hand over to Lorna to explain a bit more. Oh yes, so 827 participants, so it was an enormous body of data to then set about analysing.
Which is where I came in, and I went, oh, I like data, this is good. So obviously, as Leanna said, that was the context of the study. And we had 827 participants, all of whom had answered those initial qualitative questions about what were the positive effects of lockdown, were there any negative effects of lockdown. So our qualitative analysis using the NVivo software used all of that entire data set. When it came to the quantitative questions in relation to the PSED statements, some participants hadn't fully completed those, some had ticked more than one response. So in relation to kind of theory around what do you do with incomplete data sets, we removed any entries for that analysis that didn't have a complete set of results. So we had 761 complete entries for the quantitative analysis. We started out by doing some initial descriptive statistics in relation to, well, what are the findings? Let's look at those PSED results. Let's look at the Likert scales there and see what people are telling us. One thing that we also had in terms of the data set was we had asked whether the families were in receipt of additional funding. And so we wanted to establish initially, we thought we might explore the idea of, well, actually, is there a difference in families' experience of lockdowns, whether they are funded for their childcare places or whether they were not funded for their childcare places. So first up, we looked at the overall findings, and I'm not going to go into the results. I'm just going to tell you how we established the results, because Leanna and Deborah are going to tell you about the consequences. But we asked the initial question, was it overall a positive or a negative experience? Was it very positive, positive, neither negative or positive, but negative or very negative? And then we grouped very positive and very negative and negative to have that overall feeling of whether lockdown was considered to be a positive thing or a negative thing. We looked at that in relation to funding, whether participants were in receipt of funding or whether they were not, and the findings were very similar. And we did chi-squared analysis to see whether there was a significant difference in the experiences of funded families or non-funded families, and we found that there was no significant difference in overall experience. So to give you an idea of what happened next, for each of the PSED statements, we looked at it in relation to each statement. Did the participant say that they thought that as a result of the lockdown, things were harder in relation to that statement, things were easier, or whether the lockdown had no effect? There were 7 statements in all, but it was these 3 that we drew particularly on, because they were the ones where over half the participants agreed that there was an effect either way. And as you can see, we've got 2 statements there. I can show you what I want to play with, eat and or wear and I can follow simple routines to help me do things by myself, that over half the participants said, yeah, do you know what, that was easier. And we've got that one where there was that negative response. I know that if I take my child's toy or shout at them, they might get upset or cross. The highlighted numbers that you can see on the screen there are the overall when we combine the funded and the non-funded data. And you can see underneath how that broke down into the funded and the non-funded participants. What we then did is we said, well, actually, there's a little difference between these percentages, particularly on the bottom one. Is that significant? Is that a significant difference? And again, we did the chi-squared testing and found that actually it's not a significant difference. Deanna's going to go on to talk about the fact that we had a much smaller number of participants who were in receipt of funding, but with the testing that we did, it accounts for that difference. And we can still say that, no, that wasn't a significant difference. So after we had the quantitative analysis, and we could see those key themes in terms of those descriptive statistics, we looked through the qualitative responses using the NVivo software in relation to those themes to get the more nuanced response, to get actually what people were actually saying in relation to each of these themes. And that's where it really did become a lot more nuanced. Even within these areas that people seem to have strong opinions on one way or another, there was those little details that said, well, yes, not that, but this, not this, but that. So without further ado, you can explain that.
Yeah, so I think just to add one example around that nuance that Lorna was talking about, if you take this statement about being able to follow simple routines, for example, families were saying the change of routine and the move to lockdown was very unsettling for their child. However, their daily routine at home had become embedded, and the child was really confident within that new daily routine. So I think it just goes to show that no matter which tool you use to collect, if you are just using quantitative data, there is that nuance that can't necessarily be drawn out. So it was really interesting to read those qualitative responses to add some depth to those results. And just to pick up on what Lorna was saying about the funded and non-funded groups. So, of course, when this data was gathered in 2020, funding for 2-year-olds was the disadvantaged 2-year free entitlement funding that we were looking at. I'm really conscious that since then, funding has been extended to 2-year-olds that are not within that category. But at the time of data collection, it was very much looking at that funded group. And it was a real challenge recruiting actually funded families. And we knew we wanted to include both groups. But, you know, as lots of people find, participation in online forms for funded groups or for groups perhaps defined as disadvantaged, it can be really challenging to get the completion rates up. And I think if we were examining experiences of these families outside of lockdown, where the childcare and education settings could have played a role, you know, they have established relationships with the families or other visiting professionals working around a family, they can encourage those completion rates. But without the professionals around the families, it was really challenging getting it into their hands and then getting the completion rates when we did. So we actually only had 7% of families who counted as funded. So we didn't see statistically significant difference in results across the board between funded and non-funded, but potentially that's explained by the fact that the participants engaging with our survey were predominantly non-funded, but also seeking information online about how to support their children, and that potentially accounts for some of those results. Although interestingly, and I won't go on too much of a tangent here, but we also know that in terms of impact on 2-year-olds in formal group settings, the difference between funded and non-funded is not huge either. So potentially we're just in line with that when looking at the pause in formal group setting attendance. Yes. Anything else I want to say about that? Oh, that was the other thing I wanted to say about that. was we did also explore other variables, which we just haven't got the time to talk about here, and interestingly didn't find effect sizes either. So, for example, we had asked families whether they were employed, whether they were on furlough, whether they were unemployed, whether they were working from home or leaving the house, whether they had support with childcare informally within their bubble. And none of that seemed to have a difference, did it? It didn't seem to make a difference, which surprised us, because we wondered if parents who were multitasking more at home would have different perceptions to those who had the time to focus on their children, but it didn't appear to be that way. So I'll hand over now to Deborah to talk us through some of those qualitative findings from our open questions, which are fascinating.
All right, so we're looking at that overriding feeling of families and their perceptions of, was this a positive or was this a negative for them? Oh, just a minute, we just lost our slides. Here we go. So overall, 39% of parents felt the overall impact of lockdown was positive. So we need to find out the rest to know how that looks. So 27% of parents reported negative overall impact. So straight away, we can see that there's a difference, and it's balanced towards overall parents finding the impact was more positive than negative. In fact, that difference is 12%. And 34%, so the remainder, felt there was no overall impact either way. And this is where the image of the scales comes in, because many parents were talking about the fact that actually it was a balance. So you can see from the quotes below, overall the negative of missing out our usual activity has been balanced out by the closer bond and expanded vocabulary she has developed. Basically straightforward, the positives and negatives just balance each other out. And I think on balance, it has been fine for him. Some positives, some negatives, but nothing I would particularly worry about long term. So once again, we find that our qualitative behind the figures explains a bit more the nuances behind it, and why perhaps this 34% that there was no overall impact either way, that in some ways some children might have been falling behind, but in others they were performing better perhaps.
And it's also worth bearing in mind when looking at these findings that this was a snapshot in time taken after that first lockdown. And we wonder if we had surveyed parents after the second lockdown, when families were generally balancing a bit more, if these results would be different.
Yes, and by balancing, we're talking about juggling, that there was more work coming on board that people were expecting to have to manage, as well as coping with children at home and supporting those children at home. So we are aware that, again, the snapshot in time. And you can see that, as always with research, that all the time we're asking each other questions, we're asking questions of our data set and that position of time and what difference that may or may not have set. And that's why the longitudinal opportunity is exciting for us to see this next stage, but we'll talk a bit about that later. So with the part of the negative had a lot to do with socialisation, but there were also positives from that. So there was a keen feeling that there was a loss of face-to-face contact and support from wider networks. So from those families and friends that children would generally in their daily lives be coming into contact with. And even though there were screens available and phones available, this was not the same at all. And that was commonly cited as a negative impact. So not only, so that's just what I was saying, that the online calls did not replicate that ability to touch, to speak, to see that person in the flesh, as we'd say. So parents also reported anxiety. They were describing their children as clingy around other adults, and perhaps we're not surprised when we're thinking about that lack of socialisation might have created that. But when they were outdoors, this was particularly apparent, and it did seem to be more complex than just not mixing with those wider families and friends. And we've got some quotes on the next slide that will explain that in a bit more detail. 2-year-olds had quite clearly absorbed information about the coronavirus. Now, bearing in mind they're at home just with their small families and perhaps television is on, there was no doubt from what children were saying that they were taking things on board. And again, there's some quotes on the next slide about that. So children had certainly become alert to perceived danger, and parents spontaneously provided the actions and speech of their children. And this is coming up on the next slide. And I think for this, we'll just give you a couple of minutes to read the speech bubbles for yourselves. So when we originally saw these, I suppose we were quite shocked that these were the words that children were seeing and were saying. But when we talked about it between ourselves, it was unsurprising. This was the language that was being commonly used in homes and following things on the television. And presumably, parents were using their tablets and their phones to talk to other family and friends, which were other opportunities for children to hear things. There were certainly other things around hygiene and washing hands, and we need to wash our hands, we'll have to wash our hands now, etc. So they were making sense of their world from what they'd heard and verbalizing this. So overridingly, the finding that came back again and again and again was that around time. So all of the while, all of the time, we were coming back to time. Time impacted positively on the quality of the home learning environment in terms of relationships and daily activities for many families. So we knew from what we were being told that relationships generally were much stronger. Now, we are fully aware this wasn't the same for everybody, that for some people it was a particularly difficult time where those relationships were challenging and were struggling. But in our findings, this was overall really positive, that this time and the home learning environment were important. They made a difference from what had come before. So time together enhanced their daily lives. They had time to spend and develop close relationships with family members. And much of what we were reading was about relationships with their siblings, that those had strengthened, but also that fathers who were potentially more commonly still in this day and age at work more than some mothers, this was specifically said. The mothers were the ones more often replying to the survey, and they were stating that relationships with the father had increased and enhanced. There was time to engage in a wider range of activities and experiences at home. So people were doing different things. They were baking, they were having the arts and crafts out. And it seemed that this was a time where there was a pause. There was time to spend time with children. The children needed to be amused and parents were happy to engage in activities with them. The outdoors became particularly important. Now, again, we have to remember that during this lockdown, we were enforced and restricted to 1 hour of time outside. So it seemed, we thought it could be possible that that time was being better used, that people were really appreciating that time outside, that fresh air, the getting used to being back outside and enjoying and engaging with nature suddenly became an important part of a day for families. And they were exploring their local areas, and when they were able to, a bit beyond their local areas. So of the 1,188 mentions, so significant number of mentions, again, unsurprisingly, about family relationships. This was in the qualitative responses. 907 of them, that's 76%, were positive. They highlighted that time and opportunity to develop bonds and play with family members, especially those who might usually be at work or school. So as we said, their siblings or working members of the family. We do know that family life has increased in pace significantly over recent years, and time to engage in experiential learning as a family is often in short supply. And we can see there's a wealth of data and research behind that. But we would certainly say that this provided an opportunity to slow life down and to enjoy the moment. The identified time constraints on family life were removed for the vast majority of families during lockdown. And alongside this were the stress and guilt of insufficient time was taken. So working parents are often coming home, trying to provide a meal, trying to sort their daily routines and chores that need doing, as well as balancing childcare. It seemed that that had been removed for many, that suddenly they had this time to enjoy without the guilt of not being there for their child.
Yeah, and interestingly, even for those parents not in employment, they were still talking about the benefits of this additional time together without the pressures that day-to-day life in modern society normally brings.
And I would just add that we talked, when we've been writing about this and thinking about this more, we've looked at research about extensive parenting and intensive parenting, and this extensive parenting that happens more and more with working families who are trying to balance lots of different things and sharing that daycare. But actually that intensive pairing and that good parent, people had the time to go back to those definitions of it. In fact, the research is about intensive mothering and good mother, and we've changed that language to be parents.
So we know, we already knew going into this, that the significance of the home learning environment and the role of parents, so things like the warmth and the closeness between the parent and the child, have a significant independent effect on the development of children aged 2, separately from the development that we see in formal group childcare and education settings. What we didn't do in this study was ask the parents specifically about the nature of that home learning environment. So we can't draw too many conclusions around that. But what is fascinating is that this finding of time came up spontaneously out of those qualitative responses. And actually as well, Deborah mentioned about the guilt and the stress previously, but lots of our participants said, you know, we're just so grateful to have the chance to talk about this. And we found lots of the responses were also talking about parental mental health, which we know has an impact on child development as well. So that was fascinating as well. And one thing that arose from the qualitative responses was the time had improved, parents perceived had improved their children's vocabulary and actually the way that they constructed sentences. And although on the face of it, this could appear surprising, particularly as there was no difference in effect between funded and non-funded families. Actually, it's not all that surprising when we consider that parental closeness and warmth has a positive impact on cognitive outcomes for children aged 2. So what seemed to be coming out from these findings were we've had lots of time together as a family, and therefore I feel like my child's language has improved. They also mentioned the positive impact of time on milestones. So for example, potty training. Lots of the parents said we potty trained much earlier than we would have ordinarily if they were still attending early childcare settings. We've kind of seized the opportunity and we've potty trained during lockdown. So yeah, some interesting findings there about language, which could be a whole research paper in itself and probably will be one day. But all of these things came out of the qualitative responses. What we could have done when we designed our survey was ask specifically about every area of child development. And we didn't do that because we had that such little evidence about the impact of lockdown. We wanted to leave those questions open. But what we saw come out in the responses were all of those prime areas of development that we see in the early years education curriculum. So the responses were around physical development, they were around communication and language, and they were around personal, social, emotional development. So in terms of next steps and implications from our findings, we're obviously going to take this into the next phase, and we will be looking at the impact on their child development now. And, you know, for example, are those positive effects on language still seen? Are they not? What about family appreciation for time outdoors? Is that still there? Is it not? And so on. But in the meantime, we know that children aged 2 find lots of positive benefits of attending early childcare and early education settings, and there were some negative impacts from that pause, for example, around turn taking and relationships with peers and their emotional regulation with friendships. So we're really keen that the importance of that for 2-year-olds continues to be promoted. But we also know that that provision needs to be of really high quality so that the children can see those benefits. All of the findings from the parents seemed to say to us that time 1-to-1 or 1-to-3 between adults and 2-year-old children has a significant positive effect on child development. I don't think that would surprise any of us. And that time at home really enabled parents to see the progression in their child's development that comes with focused adult interactions and time together. So in terms of what's happening at the moment in early childcare, private voluntary settings, we thought it would be really beneficial to focus upon that responsiveness, that time where children can ask questions of us as practitioners rather than us always asking them the questions. And sometimes I think we're so focused upon planning these stimulating activities, or even encouraging families to create a stimulating environment, that we potentially forget about the benefits of time in terms of responding to the child and allowing for interactions, for example, for language. So at the moment, there are several terms around this approach within early childhood settings. So slow pedagogy, responsive pedagogy, kind of all different ways of saying we need to respond to the child and build in this time together. But we are also conscious that, within the early years educator sector, there is a quite low status actually, and any of these terms that use words like slow might actually have a negative impact, and people might think, well, early years educators, we don't do much, which we really don't want to move towards. So any suggestions for better terms we would welcome, but building in that time for responsiveness. We are also aware that this is a particular challenge at the moment for settings, because we have got recruitment and retention issues, we've got funding and budget issues, we've had ratios change, arguably for the worse, not the better, and these are all things that will impact on the quality of care for 2-year-old children. Very recently it's been in the news, it's been talked about for a while, I know, this idea of utilising primary classrooms that might be empty for early years provision is also going to shine light on these discussions about actually what does high quality care for 2-year-olds look like in formal group settings, and larger and supervised by a teacher is not the solution, we don't think. We know that more and more 2-year-olds are likely to access formal group care due to the shift in policy, and we really need to think about what that care looks like and make sure that settings are supported to provide for 2-year-olds. So, for example, although 2-year-olds have different ratios to 4-year-olds, we know that lots of settings have to channel those adults into the interactions with 4-year-olds to feel as though they're getting those children school ready, or to resolve issues around special educational needs and inclusion. So really supporting settings to provide adults to 2-year-olds and provide time for interactions as part of that. What also came through in the findings and the voices from parents is that they loved this time together. And I know that several early years organisations like Early Years Alliance, for example, have been very vocal in recent months about actually policy around high quality childcare needs to not focus so much on more and more spaces, or if it does, it also needs to be balanced out with A, what is the quality of that provision, and B, what about those families that would like to spend more time at home. So this could be about this could be about paternity leave, it could be about flexible working policies, You know, there seems to be a shift away from remote working now, which we know for parents is going to be quite challenging for some of them. So overall, we felt that policy building in choice for families to spend time together would be beneficial in building those warm, responsive bonds that seem to have had a positive impact on cognitive and social and emotional development within that period of lockdown. So we really want to harness those positive effects and give families the opportunity to keep experiencing them, and also try and take some of that time and put it within early childcare settings as well. So our next steps for us are to collect the next stage of data, which will be happening imminently. And as I say, we'll be looking at the impact on child development to see if there are long-lasting effects or if they were very brief effects that didn't go on to continue. Anything either of you would like to add?
No, I think that's all. I just would like to make a point about the choice of parents to work or spend time at home. We certainly are not advocating undoing all the work for equal rights and women's choice to work and men's choice to work. But what we just did start to discuss whether there is still a choice, or whether that expectation for financial reasons or other reasons means that some parents are returning to work because they feel they do not have an alternative, and that's drawn quite a rich discussion from us, and something that we'll potentially be exploring further.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Particularly for 2-year-olds, those kind of under 3
Yes.
Group. It would be, you know, such an ideal world if 2-year-old children could access the benefits of formal childcare and the benefits of those responsive home interactions, wouldn't it?
A rich home learning environment. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.